A single sheet of parchment from a 12th century French monastery hides a startling secret. It is not a prayer or a text, but a garden blueprint, a complex diagram of paths and plots that reveals a hidden world of strategy. This was far more than a simple guide for growing food. It was a map for building an empire of influence, carefully cultivated over centuries. By the end of this, you will see the serene monastery garden not as a quiet retreat, but as a sophisticated engine of power. How did a peaceful religious order use flower beds and herb gardens to rival kings? And what can their silent, green strategies teach us about the nature of control today? What does true power look like when it grows from the ground up? His hands, calloused and caked with earth, were not just planting seeds, they were laying the foundation for a fortress. The earliest monastic gardens, sprouting from remote clearings, were first and foremost a matter of survival. Isolated communities needed a reliable source of food and medicinal herbs to simply endure. But almost immediately, this basic need was transformed by a powerful idea. Saint Benedict's rule, the guiding document for countless monastic orders, demanded self-sufficiency. The garden became the living, breathing expression of that command. Think about that for a moment. It was not just a field of carrots and cabbages. It was a controlled environment, a world in miniature where the chaos of nature could be ordered into straight rows and organized plots. This was the first and most profound power play. By mastering their immediate landscape, these communities created islands of stability in a sea of uncertainty. They no longer had to rely on the unpredictable generosity of local lords or the failures of distant harvests. The blueprint for this garden was therefore a declaration of independence. It was a strategic document for withdrawing from the world's turbulence, creating a self-reliant bastion from which far greater influence could eventually grow. Within that fortified heart, the Cloister Garth was a world of profound silence and symbolic power. Its design was a masterclass in psychological architecture. The precise geometry of the paths, the central well representing the source of spiritual life, the four quadrants echoing the rivers of Eden, all of it was a deliberate construction. This was not a space for casual enjoyment. It was a tool for shaping thought. Every daily walk around that square under the covered walkways was a reinforcement of the rule, a physical enactment of a life lived within strict divine boundaries. The garden's order mirrored the desired order of the soul, and the abbot's authority was as present in the layout of the flower beds as it was in his sermons. This was the first and most intimate layer of monastic power, the cultivation of absolute internal discipline. Before a monk could influence the world beyond the walls, his own will had to be perfectly aligned with the community's purpose. The Cloister Garth was the engine for that alignment, a spiritual fortress that made the entire external empire of influence possible. Yet beyond the ordered soul of the cloister lay another, even more exclusive garden. The Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed garden, was a space of high walls and a single, guarded entrance, often reserved solely for the abbot and his most trusted senior monks. Blueprints for these areas are stark in their delineation of boundaries, mapping not just plants but power. To walk through that single gate was to possess a visible status, a reward for unwavering loyalty and high rank. This was far more than a quiet place for contemplation. It was a sophisticated political instrument. By controlling access to this cultivated paradise, the monastic leadership masterfully reinforced the social hierarchy. The very act of excluding the majority created an aura of mystery and authority around the few who were permitted inside. the garden's beauty and serenity became a currency, its inaccessibility amplifying its value and, by extension, the power of those who enjoyed it. It was a living, breathing demonstration of the inner circle's elevated position, a quiet but constant reminder of the rewards awaiting those who climbed the ladder. This strategic use of an exclusive space was a masterclass in managing human ambition, tying personal aspiration directly to the structure of monastic authority. But the most potent power was cultivated not in the cloister's silence, but in the quiet hum of the infirmary. Here, the garden blueprint transformed into a living pharmacy, a strategic arsenal of healing. Each carefully drawn plot was assigned a specific purpose. This section was for sage to sharpen a fading memory. That row was for lavender to soothe a troubled mind. Over there, valerian root grew deep, ready to brew a potion for restful sleep. In an age of widespread sickness and limited medical knowledge, the monks who tended these gardens became the most important doctors in Europe. Their expertise, literally planted into the soil, gave them an unassailable form of leverage. Think of a local lord struck by a fever that no court physician could cure. His only hope might be the monastery's infirmary and the herbal knowledge cultivated within its walls. By healing the noble, the monks did not just save a life. They created a debt for the peasant family whose child was nursed back to health with a simple poultice. The monastery became a source of profound loyalty. This was a brilliant charitable strategy. The garden blueprint was a map of this influence, a design that translated roots and leaves into a vast network of obligation. Healing became a currency more valuable than gold, purchasing not land, but something far more durable, the unwavering trust and dependence of an entire region. This soft power, grown from the earth, secured the monastery's place as an indispensable pillar of society for centuries. Yet the most closely guarded secrets were cultivated in the Physic garden, a living library of potent flora. Its blueprint was not merely a planting guide but a complex catalogue, a map of esoteric knowledge where every leaf and root held a dual purpose. A plant like mandrake, with its strangely human-shaped root, was carefully sketched and noted for its power to induce sleep during surgery. But in the popular imagination, it was also a mystical talisman capable of granting luck or love. The monks, through their meticulous study, understood the real science behind the superstition. This gave them an incredible advantage. In a world where most could not read a single sentence, the ability to decipher this green text, to know that this flower cured a fever and that berry could kill, was a form of magic. It was a monopoly on practical, life-saving secrets. A local lord might consult the abbot not only for prayer but for a remedy for his ailing crops or a potion to ensure his wife's safe childbirth. The monastery thus became the indispensable repository of both spiritual and earthly wisdom. By controlling this specialized knowledge, the monks positioned themselves as the sole interpreters of nature's deepest mysteries, their authority rooted as deeply in the soil of the Physic garden as it was in their holy texts. Beyond the Physic garden's potent secrets lay a landscape of astonishing scale and order. The orchard blueprint reveals row upon row of apple, pear, and cherry trees, each one positioned with geometric precision. This was not merely a source of food, it was a strategy of calculated abundance. Every tree was an economic unit in a grand design. The sheer volume of fruit harvested from these orchards could never be consumed by the monks alone. Instead, it was systematically processed into valuable goods, pressed into crisp ciders, simmered into sweet preserves, and fermented into sharp vinegars. The blueprint was, in essence, an economic forecast written in bark and leaf. It projected the annual yield, planned for massive storage in deep cellars and vast barns, and facilitated a robust internal economy that buzzed with activity. This self-sufficiency created a powerful financial shield. It insulated the monastery from the wild price swings of local markets and the constant, draining demands of feudal lords. The wealth generated from these orchards was pure fuel for ambition. It paid for the soaring arches of new chapels, purchased tracts of surrounding land, and funded patronage of the arts. A single harvest of apples could be transformed into the wages for a master stonemason. A season's yield of pears could buy a priceless, illuminated manuscript. The quiet, orderly orchard was therefore one of the most potent engines of monastic power, transforming simple agricultural planning into a foundation for lasting financial growth and stability, funding an empire built not on conquest but on careful cultivation. But the most spiritually significant blueprint was reserved for the sun-drenched slopes of the vineyard. Here, the precise terracing and careful orientation of each row were not just about maximizing sunlight. They were about guaranteeing the purity of a sacred substance. Wine was the essential, non-negotiable element of the Mass, the very blood of Christ in the central ritual of medieval faith. By controlling its production from soil to sacramental cup, the monastery held a divine monopoly. This was a power that transcended earthly markets. The quality of their vintage could elevate their reputation with a visiting bishop. A generous annual shipment to the papal court in Rome could secure invaluable favors and recognition. The vineyard blueprint was a direct line to the highest echelons of the church. Yet this spiritual power had a perfectly material twin. No community, not even the most devout, could drink all the wine its vineyards produced. The surplus flowed into a thriving secular trade. A cask of fine monastic wine was a luxury good, traded for other necessities or sold for hard currency. This created a brilliant, self-reinforcing cycle. The sacred demand for the Eucharist justified the vineyard's existence and scale, while the secular trade in the surplus funded the monastery's expansion and influence. One single blueprint, therefore, managed a dual economy. It was a plan for participating in the divine ritual that connected them to heaven, and the earthly commerce that secured their power on earth, a potent combination that made the vineyard the most spiritually and economically strategic garden of them all. These quiet agricultural outposts were the true frontier of monastic power. Scattered across the countryside, the Granges were more than just remote farms. They were strategic footholds placed with the precision of a military campaign to command the landscape. Estate maps from the period reveal this brilliant design. One Grange would be established on rich river plain soil, its blueprint dedicated entirely to the mass production of grain. Another would be positioned high on windswept hills, its fields outlined for vast flocks of sheep. A third would be nestled against a dense forest, its plan focused on timber and charcoal production. This was not random settlement. It was a deliberate strategy of resource diversification, a way to ensure that no single crop failure or market collapse could threaten the entire monastic economy. By controlling these varied terrains, a single monastery could simultaneously produce wool for the lucrative cloth trade, grain to feed its growing population and sell for profit, and timber to fuel its forges and build its expanding structures. This made them formidable economic entities, their wealth and reach often rivaling that of the most powerful secular barons. The coordination required to manage this sprawling network was immense. Lay brothers, a separate class of religious workers, lived and toiled at these outposts, their labor directed by a central administrative office within the abbey. The abbot and his council did not merely pray. They became master logisticians, managing supply chains, forecasting harvests, and moving goods between their satellite Granges with the skill of a modern corporation. The overall blueprint of their landholdings, therefore, was not just a map of property. It was a living diagram of a sophisticated economic web, a clear demonstration of their ability to project power and control across an entire region, far beyond the silent stones of their cloister. The quiet flow of a diverted stream reveals the final, and perhaps most absolute, layer of monastic power. While their gardens grew food and their vineyards produced wine, it was their command over water itself that truly cemented their dominance. The most detailed blueprints show not just plants and paths, but intricate networks of canals, sluice gates, and stone-lined conduits snaking across the landscape. Water was the lifeblood of the medieval world, and the monastery that controlled its flow held a power more fundamental than any sword. By securing legal rights to dam a river or divert a spring, an abbot gained a strategic lever over everyone downstream. A peasant village miles away now depended on his goodwill to keep their own fields irrigated and their mill wheel turning. This was a quiet, constant form of control, a reminder of who truly shaped the environment. Their hydraulic engineering was a breathtaking display of superiority. They constructed massive, multi-tiered fish ponds, sophisticated aquaculture systems that provided a reliable, high-status source of protein all year round, especially on holy days when meat was forbidden. More dramatically, they harnessed water's raw force to power grain mills and fulling mills for processing wool. This technological leap transformed their economy. They could grind their own grain into flour faster than any hand-powered method, and they could charge local farmers a fee to use their facility, a practice known as milling soak. This was not just a convenience, it was a monopoly. The constant, controlled rush of water through their mill races became the sound of their economic engine, a physical manifestation of their ability to harness nature itself for profit and production. Ultimately, the water management blueprint was a declaration. It showed an institution so powerful, so advanced that it could reshape the very geography to its needs. In a world where most people were at the mercy of droughts and floods, the monastery presented itself as an island of civilized order, a place where nature was not a threat to be endured, but a force to be mastered. This command over the most essential resource reinforced their image as divinely favored stewards, projecting an aura of unshakable authority. Their power did not just rise from the soil. It flowed through the water they so expertly commanded. Even the finality of death was woven into their strategic design. Tucked beside the cloister or nestled within the orchard, the monastic cemetery was never an afterthought. Its placement on the garden blueprint was a deliberate statement, a final, powerful layer of influence. To be buried on this consecrated ground, as close as possible to the saints and holy relics within the church walls, was seen as a direct path to salvation. For the wealthy noble or the rising merchant, this was not merely a matter of prestige. It was the ultimate spiritual insurance policy, and the monasteries held the exclusive rights to sell it. This practice, known formally as the sale of sepulture, was a masterstroke of long-term strategy. A single, lavish payment from a baron's family would secure him a prime plot, his physical remains forever linked to the divine power of the abbey. But the transaction did not end with the burial. It created a bond of obligation that stretched across generations. The family of the deceased now had a vested, eternal interest in the monastery's continued prosperity and prayers. They became perpetual patrons, offering regular donations for masses to be said for their ancestors' soul, ensuring the financial pipeline remained open long after the initial sale. The cemetery blueprint, therefore, was far more than a chart of graves. It was a living map of social and political alliances, each tombstone marking a successful pact with the secular world. It wove the most powerful local families directly into the monastic fabric, turning the very earth of the garden into a network of patronage that secured wealth and influence from beyond the grave. From the Scriptorium window, the view of the garden was a lesson in itself. A monk spending his days copying texts would look out upon a world of perfect geometry, each plant in its assigned place, every path a straight line leading to a clear destination. This was not a random scene. It was a carefully composed landscape intended to shape the very process of thought. The serene order outside was meant to inspire an equally ordered mind within, a mind capable of the precise, patient work of preserving knowledge. This control over the environment was a subtle form of information management, the same disciplined focus required to tend a perfect row of medicinal herbs was needed to transcribe a complex philosophical treatise without error. The garden was a living metaphor for the library, both of them organized, categorized systems where every element had its proper place and purpose. And just as they controlled the cultivation of plants, the monks held an absolute monopoly on the cultivation of ideas. In the Scriptorium, they decided which ancient texts from Greece and Rome were valuable enough to be saved from oblivion. They determined which new works would be copied and distributed across Europe. This included the creation of their own herbals, beautifully illustrated books that documented the secrets of their gardens. These were not merely gardening guides. They were encrypted power, compiling generations of hard-won knowledge about which plants could heal, which could poison, and which could influence the mind. By choosing what information to preserve and what to discard, the monastery positioned itself as the indispensable gatekeeper of Western civilization's memory. A local lord seeking an education for his son, or a bishop needing a reliable copy of a papal decree, had no other option. They had to come to the monastery. This role as the intellectual custodian of an entire continent created a power base that was both deeply respected and quietly feared. Their authority was rooted not in arms but in parchment, a dominion built one carefully copied word at a time. Every flower in the monastic garden was a carefully chosen word in a silent sermon. The deliberate placement of a pure white lily near the church entrance, the cluster of red roses symbolizing martyrdom along a central path, the modest violets tucked into shaded corners to signify humility, all of these were part of a sophisticated visual language. This was a power strategy that operated on a deeply subconscious level. A visiting pilgrim or a new novice would not simply see a beautiful arrangement of plants. They would walk through a living catechism, their very senses being instructed in the core values of the order without a single lecture being given. The garden blueprint was a theological script written in leaf and petal, designed to shape belief through beauty and order. But this symbolic cultivation extended beyond common local flowers. The ability to grow exotic specimens, a bay laurel from the Mediterranean or a rare iris from the East, was a quiet yet potent boast. It demonstrated that the monastery's influence and its network of knowledge stretched across continents, that it could command and nurture rarities unknown to the local nobility. This display of horticultural sophistication was a form of soft power that impressed wealthy patrons and intimidated rivals. It communicated that this was not an isolated backwater, but a center of cosmopolitan reach, a place where even the soil spoke of connections to a wider, more learned world. The garden was therefore both a school for the faithful and a banner of institutional prestige, its symbolic flora reinforcing doctrine for the devoted while projecting an image of unassailable authority to all who entered. The scent of lavender and rosemary greeted a weary traveler long before they passed through the monastery gate. Just steps from the guesthouse entrance, a special garden was cultivated not for prayer or medicine, but for perception. This was the diplomacy of fragrance and form, a carefully managed first impression for every important visitor. A papal legate arriving from the dust and chaos of the road would be led through this serene space, its shaded walks and benches inviting quiet conversation. The air itself, perfumed with calming herbs, was a silent argument for the monastery's refined order and spiritual grace. Hospitality was a sacred duty, yes, but here it was honed into a strategic art. The guesthouse garden was a stage, and every plant was a performer in a subtle play of power. Imagine a rival abbot, perhaps skeptical of the community's reputation, being received in this tranquil setting. The perfectly manicured paths, the soothing sounds of a nearby fountain, the visual harmony of flowering plants all conveyed a single, unshakable message. This was a house of God, certainly, but it was also a house of profound competence and unassailable stability. A nobleman considering a major donation would see not just piety but prosperity. He would witness an institution so in control of its environment that it could afford to dedicate precious land and labor solely to the comfort of its guests. The blueprint for this garden was therefore a masterwork of public relations. It was designed to make a powerful visitor feel both honored and at ease, putting them in a receptive state of mind. A favorable judgment in a land dispute, a generous grant of new privileges, a sizable bequest in a last will and testament, these were the fruits that such a garden was cultivated to bear. It transformed the sacred act of welcome into a lasting investment, securing the outside alliances and patronage that allowed the monastery's influence to flourish for centuries. Those high garden walls were far more than a spiritual boundary. Look closely at the perimeter of any detailed blueprint, and you will see a defensive structure as calculated as any castle's outer curtain. The thick masonry, the single, heavily monitored gate, the way the paths twisted into confusing knots just inside the entrance, all of this was deliberate. While these barriers created a sacred refuge from worldly distractions, they also served a brutally practical purpose. They were the first and most vital line of physical defense. In an era of local rebellions, roving bandits, and the private armies of rival lords, the monastery was a treasure house. Its granaries bulged with grain from the granges, its cellars were stocked with barrels of wine and cider, and its infirmary held precious stores of medicinal herbs. This made it a tempting target, but the garden itself was part of the fortress. The compartmentalized layout, with its maze of hedges and sunken paths, was designed to disorient and slow down any intruder who managed to breach the outer wall. An attacker would not find a straight, open path to the church or the treasury. He would be funneled into a labyrinth of green, vulnerable to counterattack from the covered walkways above. This was a security plan written in soil and stone. It reveals a profound and pragmatic understanding that spiritual authority, no matter how divinely inspired, was utterly dependent on temporal survival. The serene garden was therefore the peaceful face of a deeply fortified position, a clear statement that the monastery's power was not only cultivated but also fiercely, intelligently defended. The scent of simmering stew from the monastery kitchen carried the taste of a carefully managed identity. Just outside, the sprawling kitchen garden was a hub of constant activity, its layout a direct reflection of the community's social blueprint. Rows of cabbages, leeks, onions, and beans grew in abundance, supplying the single, shared meal that sustained every monk without exception. This was a profound and deliberate strategy. By ensuring that the abbot and the newest novice ate from the same harvest, the garden physically enacted the core Benedictine ideal of equality before God. The food itself became a daily, tangible reminder that personal status held no place at the refectory table. This shared sustenance did more than fill stomachs, it forged a powerful collective spirit. The distinct ambitions and backgrounds each man brought through the gate were systematically softened by the common rhythm of planting, tending, and breaking bread together. Individualism was a weed that could not take root in soil cultivated for unity. The success of the entire community, its ability to pray, work, and project power, was quite literally tied to the success of these humble vegetable plots. This made every monk a direct stakeholder in the system's survival. The loyalty cultivated here in the simple act of growing and sharing food was the essential, invisible foundation. Without this bedrock of internal cohesion, all the external strategies of healing, trade, and diplomacy would have crumbled into dust. The kitchen garden was the engine of the communal soul, the quiet, green heart that kept the entire body of the monastery beating as one. The garden blueprint held another, more human secret, a division of labor as carefully planned as the herb beds. While the choir monks devoted their days to prayer and parchment in the cloister, the vast agricultural empire beyond the walls was cultivated by the hands of the lay brothers, known as conversi. These were not ordained monks, but men who had dedicated their lives to the order through manual work. Their inclusion was a masterstroke of social engineering. By welcoming these laborers, the monastery solved a fundamental problem. It could expand its economic reach across thousands of acres without forcing its scholarly and liturgical core to abandon their sacred duties. The blueprint itself reveals this internal hierarchy. The areas designated for the lay brothers were always separate, their dormitories and workshops physically removed from the serene heart of the cloister. This segregation was deliberate, creating a clear, two-tiered society under one roof. The choir monks elevated their spiritual and intellectual pursuits precisely because the conversi shouldered the burden of earthly toil. One group's hands were kept clean for prayer and writing, while the others were calloused from the plow and the pruning hook. This was not merely a division of tasks. It was a strategy of human resource allocation perfected over centuries. The labor of the many directly enabled the influence of the few, creating a system where every type of manpower was harnessed to maximize the monastery's total power, both spiritual and temporal. The quiet efficiency of the entire operation depended on this unspoken agreement, a social contract written not on parchment, but enacted daily in the segregated spaces of the garden. The turning of the liturgical calendar dictated every spade of earth turned in the monastic garden. Planting was not merely a response to the spring thaw, but a ritual act tied to the feast of a particular saint. The harvest was synchronized with a period of fasting, its bounty a divine reward for piety. This was a brilliant fusion of the solar and the sacred, a strategy that transformed exhausting agricultural labor into a continuous living prayer. The garden blueprint, therefore, was more than a spatial map. It was a meticulously planned timetable, choreographing the community's annual cycle to the rhythm of the heavens and the church. When a monk sowed seeds during Lent, he was not just ensuring a future meal. He was physically enacting the themes of death and resurrection central to that holy season. His calloused hands became instruments of worship, and the sprouting pea shoots were a testament to answered prayer. This sacralization of work was a powerful psychological tool. It erased the line between the mundane and the divine, making every weeding session and every apple picked an integral part of their cosmic purpose. For the monks inside the walls, this constant reinforcement bred an unshakable internal resolve. Their lives were not a series of separate tasks, but a single, harmonious liturgy sung with their bodies as much as their voices. To an outside observer, a pilgrim witnessing this perfectly synchronized dance of faith and flora, the message was unmistakable. Here was a community living in a state of grace, so perfectly aligned with God's will that even the seasons obeyed their sacred schedule. This projection of divine harmony was the ultimate soft power, making the monastery's authority feel not just institutional but celestial, a force as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. The Herbarium was a living perfume factory, its strategic purpose carried on the very air the monks breathed. Beyond the healing properties of mint for an upset stomach or the culinary use of thyme lay a deeper, more atmospheric form of control. Every footstep in the cloister walkways released a fresh, cleansing scent. The rushes strewn across the stone floors were not mere floor covering. They were carefully packed with crushed lavender, rosemary, and sweet woodruff, creating a fragrant carpet that actively masked the less pleasant odors of a large, enclosed community. In an age when bad air was believed to directly cause sickness, this practice was not just about comfort. It was a deliberate act of environmental purification, a way to create a bubble of perceived health and sanctity. This meticulous management of the sensory landscape made the monastery feel fundamentally different from the world outside its walls. A visitor arriving from a crowded, unsanitary medieval town would step into an environment that was not only visually ordered but olfactorily pristine. The contrast was staggering and deeply persuasive. The constant, subtle fragrance of holiness was a powerful, unspoken argument. It told everyone who breathed it in that this was a place where the body was cared for as diligently as the soul, where divine order manifested not just in prayer books but in the very scent of the air. The garden blueprint, by designating space for this aromatic arsenal, was engineering an entire lived experience, crafting an atmosphere so distinct and superior that it made the monastic life seem like the only truly civilized choice. Standing on a hill overlooking the entire monastic complex, a visiting king or count would not see just a church and some fields. He would see a perfect miniature version of his own world, but one that seemed to function with a divine harmony his own court could never achieve. The garden blueprint in its totality was a map of this idealized feudal kingdom in microcosm. The abbot, ruling from his private enclosed garden, was the unquestioned lord of the manor. The choir monks, with their sacred literacy and liturgical duties, were his knights of the spirit, a spiritual aristocracy. The lay brothers toiling in the distant granges were the peasant class, the essential engine of manual labor that made the entire system run. And the land itself, meticulously divided into vineyards, orchards, fish ponds, and herb beds, was the managed landscape of this green realm. This was not an accidental resemblance. It was a deliberate, powerful political statement. The monastery was demonstrating a model of governance that claimed a higher authority than any secular crown, one based on divine law and perfect order. While a baron's rule might be capricious, swayed by personal ambition or violence, the abbot's authority was presented as stable, sacred, and eternally just. This gave the monastery a powerful platform for critique. They could, and often did, position themselves as the moral and administrative superiors to the local nobility. In regional disputes over land or resources, their voice carried immense weight precisely because their own domain was so visibly prosperous and peaceful. A count embroiled in a bitter conflict with a rival would find the monastery's support invaluable, not because they had an army, but because they held the unshakable credibility of a kingdom that worked. Their garden was their proof, a living argument that their way of ordering the world was the one blessed by heaven itself. The stones of a Roman villa, repurposed into a monastery's foundation, tell a story of deliberate inheritance. When monks established their communities atop these ruins, they were not just scavenging for building materials, they were making a profound claim about their place in the world. The formal, geometric garden layouts they adopted directly echoed the courtyards and peristyle gardens of the Roman elite, a conscious echo of a lost age of sophistication. This was far more than an aesthetic choice. It was a brilliant strategy of strategic continuity. In a fractured post-Roman world where local warlords held power but little cultural legitimacy, the monastery presented itself as the true heir to classical civilization's knowledge and order. Their garden blueprints became a tangible bridge across the centuries, a living argument that the light of Rome had not been extinguished but merely transferred into their care. By mastering and adapting Roman horticulture, especially the complex hydraulics for fountains and irrigation, the monks demonstrated a technical prowess that their new barbarian neighbors could not match. A Frankish chieftain ruling by the sword might command an army, but he could not command water to flow through stone channels or design a garden based on Pythagorean principles. This claim to a grand intellectual heritage was a powerful tool. It granted the monks an unassailable cultural and intellectual authority, positioning them not as isolated holy men, but as the indispensable curators of all that had been wise and orderly in the ancient world. Their garden was the proof, a quiet, green manifesto that they were the rightful guardians of civilization itself. Even the purest spiritual ideals found their ultimate expression in the soil. When a new wave of reform swept through the monastic world, it did not just change the prayers recited within the cloister. It tore up the garden blueprints and started again. The rise of the Cistercian order in the 12th century was a revolution, and their stark, functional landscapes were its most visible declaration of war against the established Benedictine houses. They looked at the ornate, intricate gardens of older monasteries, with their fragrant pleasure plots and exclusive enclosures, and saw not beauty but dangerous vanity. A Cistercian blueprint was a statement of protest etched in the earth. It stripped away all non-essential plants, all decorative flourishes, all complex geometric patterns that hinted at leisure or luxury. What remained were vast, open fields for practical crops, simple herb beds for basic medicine, and efficient orchards for sustenance. This was not an aesthetic preference. It was a theological argument made visible. The garden's radical simplicity was a direct and powerful critique, accusing the older orders of having lost their way, of having become corrupted by the very world they were meant to renounce. In the great internal power struggle for the soul of monasticism, the Cistercians wielded their spades as effectively as their sermons. By presenting a landscape of such austere purity, they positioned themselves as the true heirs to Saint Benedict's original vision of poverty and hard labor. Their gardens became recruiting tools, attracting devout novices disillusioned with the perceived softness of other communities. More importantly, this visible commitment to austerity won them immense favor with powerful popes and bishops who were themselves trying to reform the wider church. A pope looking for a model of uncorrupted devotion needed only to compare the lavish gardens of a traditional abbey with the severe, purposeful fields of a Cistercian house. The choice was obvious. The landscape itself became a weapon in a high-stakes ideological battle, proving that control over the physical environment was ultimately about controlling the narrative of holiness and securing the highest echelons of influence within the medieval church. The same sacred garden blueprint looked utterly different in the hands of a Scottish monk compared to his Italian brother. In the misty, rain-lashed highlands, a monastery's power was not declared with exotic citrus trees, but with the deep, earthy scent of a turnip cellar packed full for a 6-month winter. Their survival, and thus their influence, depended on a completely different set of botanical strategies. They became masters of developing hardy, cold-resistant varieties of cabbages and grains that could withstand early frosts. Their blueprints prioritized not ornamental beauty, but the sprawling, essential structures for preservation, massive barns for hay and root cellars dug deep into the frigid ground. In this harsh climate, the power to feed a community through the long, dark months was a form of authority that commanded absolute loyalty. A local chieftain whose own stores might run thin by February would see the monastery's steady, well-managed abundance as a divine endorsement and a practical necessity. Their garden was a fortress against the cold, and its enduring bounty was their strongest claim to regional leadership. Meanwhile, under the relentless Italian sun, a different kind of power was cultivated. Here, water was life itself, and the blueprint was a map of hydraulic domination. A monastery established in an arid valley did not just plant a garden, it created an oasis through a network of cisterns, aqueducts, and shaded irrigation channels that its secular neighbors could only dream of replicating. Their strategic advantage came from a miraculous, year-round greenness. While the local farmers' fields turned brown and brittle in the summer heat, the monastery's orchards of olives and figs thrived, its vineyards produced lush grapes, and its herb gardens remained a vibrant carpet of green. This visible control over the most precious resource made them the undisputed masters of the landscape. A baron whose own wells ran dry would be forced to negotiate with the abbot for water rights, a transaction that always came with a price, whether in land, political favor, or public deference. The monastic garden, therefore, was never a single, rigid plan. It was a fluid, intelligent response to local conditions. A community's power strategy was literally rooted in the soil and climate it inhabited. This brilliant adaptability, this capacity to read the land and write a blueprint for dominance in whatever language the environment demanded, was the true secret to their enduring success across a continent. They proved that the most formidable power is not the one that conquers nature, but the one that learns to harness its unique, local rhythms for its own enduring purpose. A king's signature could erase 1,000 years of green strategy in a single stroke. The dissolution of the monasteries in 16th century England was not a gradual decline. It was a swift, surgical strike by the crown to dismantle the most powerful non-royal institution in the land. Commissioners armed with royal warrants arrived at abbey gates, their goal to systematically dismantle a rival empire. The seizure of gold and land was obvious, but the true target was far more profound. It was the monopoly itself, the very system of intertwined spiritual and economic authority that the gardens had so carefully cultivated. The state was now reclaiming control over healing, over food production, over the souls of the dead, and over the flow of information. As the lead was stripped from the roofs and the stones of the cloister were carted away for manor houses, something less visible but equally vital was being lost. The meticulously kept garden blueprints, those complex diagrams of power, were torn from their registers and scattered to the winds. Some were used to light fires. Others were repurposed as scrap paper for merchants' accounts. A few were tucked away in private libraries, their meaning fading into obscurity. Each lost blueprint represented a shattered piece of a continent-spanning intelligence network. The knowledge of which herb could slow a hemorrhage, the precise angle for a vineyard terrace to maximize sun, the secret to keeping apple varieties pure across generations. This was esoteric data that evaporated with the communities that had curated it. The fragmentation was catastrophic. It severed the living connection between the land and the deep, strategic understanding that had governed it for centuries. A local village that had depended on the monastery's infirmary for generations now found itself without that source of healing wisdom. The intricate water management systems, without the monastic engineers to maintain them, often silted up and failed, leading to floods or droughts downstream. This was more than the destruction of buildings. It was the dismantling of a vast organic computer, its memory wiped and its processing units smashed. The silent, cultivated influence that had weathered famines and feudal wars proved utterly defenseless against the blunt instrument of royal decree. In the end, the Green Empire's greatest weakness was revealed. It could negotiate with nature and outmaneuver nobles, but it could not withstand the focused, jealous power of the state, a stark reminder that the most carefully grown authority can still be uprooted by a stronger force. A ghost now walks those vanished garden paths, its footsteps traced not in soil but in data. Modern archaeology has given us the tools to see this phantom, to read the landscape long after the last plant has turned to dust. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses deep into the earth, painting a picture of what lies beneath the tranquil grass of a former abbey. The scans reveal the stark geometry of buried stone pathways exactly where the blueprints said they would be, and the faint, rectangular ghosts of raised herb beds, their soil still distinct from the surrounding earth after 800 years. This is not guesswork, it is a direct technological conversation with the past, and the past is answering. Soil core analysis adds another layer of proof, detecting chemical signatures and microscopic pollen grains that tell a precise story of what once grew there. A spike in nitrogen and phosphorus in one plot corroborates the blueprints label for a kitchen garden, enriched by centuries of compost. The unexpected pollen of a fig tree, found in a soil layer from a northern English monastery, suddenly makes sense of a tiny notation on a worn parchment about a shipment from the Mediterranean. This scientific validation is transformative. It turns the elegant lines on a vellum blueprint from a theoretical proposal into a confirmed record of historical action. We are no longer just interpreting symbols on a page. We are standing on the very ground those symbols governed, finding the physical proof that the strategy was real. Perhaps the most human evidence comes from the most humble of places, the analysis of preserved seeds and plant remains found in monastery latrines offers a brutally honest inventory of daily life. Finding the pits of imported olives or the seeds of exotic spices in these contexts provides the final, tangible link in a chain of influence the blueprints only hinted at. It confirms that the complex trade networks, the economic reach sketched in ink, actually delivered their goods to the monastic table. Archaeology, therefore, does more than just confirm the blueprints. It grounds our entire understanding of monastic power in the tangible, the excavated, the real. It proves that this green empire was not built on paper, but planted, one strategic seed at a time, into the waiting earth. These medieval blueprints for power resonate with a startling clarity in our modern world. The serene monastery garden finds its direct descendant in the sprawling, self-contained corporate campus of a 21st century tech giant. Both are designed as worlds unto themselves, offering everything from food and healthcare to fitness and leisure within their controlled boundaries. This is not merely a convenience for employees. It is a sophisticated strategy for fostering loyalty and creating a distinct, insular culture, much like the monastic ideal of self-sufficiency. Walk through the manicured grounds of such a place, and you are walking through a modern cloister Garth, an environment engineered to shape behavior and secure a dedicated workforce. The principle of the exclusive Hortus Conclusus is alive and well in the top-floor executive suite or the members-only club high above the city. Access is strictly controlled, the design is meticulously curated, and the very act of being granted entry reinforces a clear corporate hierarchy. These spaces are modern enclosures, using exclusivity as a currency of status and control. And what of the monastery's monopoly on healing herbs and sacred knowledge? Today, that power is held by pharmaceutical companies guarding their chemical formulas and technology firms protecting their proprietary algorithms. This specialized knowledge is the new mandrake root, a potent secret that creates market dominance and immense influence. The ability to heal or to connect the world grants a form of soft power that governments must negotiate with. The garden blueprint, in its essence, was an early and brilliant business plan. It meticulously outlined resource management in its orchards and granges. It established a powerful brand identity through its symbolic flora and harmonious design. It secured market positioning by making the monastery the region's sole provider of salvation, healing, and stability. When we analyze these ancient strategies, we are not just studying history. We are holding up a mirror to our own institutions. The dynamics of building a fortress, controlling a narrative, and monopolizing a vital resource remain the fundamental levers of influence. The language has changed from Latin to corporate jargon, and the currency has shifted from prayers to patents, but the blueprint for power itself has endured for 1,000 years. Yet the most profound questions raised by these garden blueprints are not about their success, but about their soul. For all their sophistication, these were ultimately systems of control, meticulously governing land, knowledge, and human labor under the sacred banner of piety. The immense wealth generated by the orchards and granges, the political influence secured through healing and hospitality, often led the most powerful monasteries into the very worldliness their founders had sought to escape. The same reforms that championed austerity, like those of the Cistercians, were often a direct response to the perceived corruption and luxury of older, wealthier houses. The garden, in its abundance, could become a temptation, its very success undermining the spiritual ideals it was meant to support. And what of the silent army of lay brothers, the conversi, whose calloused hands worked the distant fields? Their labor was the indispensable engine of the entire operation, yet they lived in segregated quarters, a spiritual underclass denied the liturgical life of the choir monks. This arrangement, so efficient for the system, forces us to confront a difficult ethical question. Can a spiritual mission be built upon a foundation that so clearly divides men into laborers and elites, even if all consent? The garden blueprint, in its clean lines and perfect order, does not show us the sweat on a brow or the quiet resentment in a heart. It presents a vision of harmony, but it also maps a hierarchy. This forces a necessary and sobering reflection. When does the virtuous pursuit of self-sufficiency cross the line into simple greed? At what point does the exercise of spiritual authority for the good of the community become a form of temporal oppression over the surrounding populace, who now depend on your mill, your medicine, and your god? The brilliance of the monastic power strategy is undeniable, but it is not without its shadows. It stands as a timeless cautionary tale, a reminder that the most elegant systems, whether of faith or of finance, are always wielded by fallible human hands. The concentration of power, even when cultivated with the most pious intentions, carries within it the enduring seed of corruption. That ghost in the soil became a permanent resident of our modern world. The influence of the monastic blueprint did not simply fade away with the dissolution of the abbeys. It was quietly absorbed, its strategic DNA woven into the very fabric of our landscape and culture. Take a flight over the countryside in certain regions of France or England, and you can still see it from the air. The patchwork of fields, those irregular rectangles and long, narrow strips, often follows the exact boundaries of the ancient monastic granges. The logic of that 12th century economic diversification strategy is literally frozen in the property lines of the 21st century. The monks' careful division of the land for grain, sheep, and timber set a template that would endure for 1,000 years, outlasting the walls of the cloister that first conceived it. This is not a forgotten history. It is a living geography, a testament to how thoroughly their practical vision reshaped the European continent. Then consider the formal gardens of the Renaissance. When wealthy merchants and powerful princes sought to display their own refinement and control over nature, where did they turn for inspiration? They looked directly to the monastery. The geometric precision of the palace garden, with its symmetrical parterres, its central fountains, and its orderly paths, is a direct and conscious echo of the cloister Garth. It was the monks who first perfected that language of ordered space, using it to represent divine harmony. The secular elite simply adopted that same vocabulary to represent their own temporal power, building their own open-air declarations of authority using a borrowed monastic grammar. Even our most beloved public spaces carry this ancient imprint. The modern botanical garden, with its plants carefully labeled and organized by family or region, is the direct heir to the monastic Physic garden. Both are living libraries designed for study and education. The very concept of a public park, a curated green space meant for the refreshment and improvement of the community, borrows its underlying philosophy from the monastery's role as a spiritual and physical refuge. Our deep-seated cultural idea that a garden should be a place of both beauty and purpose, a harmonious blend of the aesthetic and the utilitarian, is a seed those medieval monks planted. Their strategic vision was so pervasive, so brilliantly conceived, that it escaped the bounds of its original walls and began to shape the world itself, leaving a quiet, green legacy that continues to grow all around us. We have followed the lines of these ancient diagrams from the cloister's symbolic heart to the sprawling, profit-generating granges. This was never a simple map for planting vegetables. It was a master plan, a multi-layered strategic document for constructing an empire of influence that blended prayer with production and devotion with dominion. These monasteries were not passive islands of prayer. They were dynamic, sophisticated organizations that leveraged every resource, from a healing herb to a diverted stream, to secure their enduring place in a turbulent world. Their true genius lay in understanding that the most resilient power is not seized in a sudden, violent coup, but cultivated with patience, season after season, in the quiet and ordered spaces far from the noise of the battlefield. The silent language of their gardens, written in root and vine, teaches us that control over the fundamental elements of life, food, water, health, and knowledge, forges an authority that can outlast any dynasty. So the next time you walk through a beautifully ordered park or a corporate campus, pause for a moment. Look at the layout of the paths, the placement of the trees, the flow of the water features. Ask yourself what hidden blueprints we are drafting today. What strategies for influence and control are we planting into our own landscapes? What will future historians deduce about our values, our hierarchies, and our deepest ambitions from the silent, green world we are building right now? If this journey through the medieval garden has reshaped your view of history, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more explorations into the hidden patterns that have secretly shaped our world.